The fifth chapter, War. On our way back to the village, the doctor began discussing natural history with Long Arrow, but their most interesting talk, mainly about plants, had hardly begun when an Indian runner came dashing up to us with a message. Long Arrow listened gravely to the breathless, babbled words, then turned to the doctor and said in eagle tongue, "Great white man, an evil thing has befallen the Popsipetels, our neighbors to the southward, the thievish Jagdarags, who for so long have cast envious eyes on our stores of ripe corn, have gone upon the warpath, and even now are advancing to attack us." "Evil news indeed," said the doctor. "You let us not judge harshly. Perhaps it is that they are desperate for food, having their own crops frost-killed before harvest. Or are they not even nearer the cold south than you?" "Make no excuses for any man of the tribe of the Jagdarags," said Long Arrow, shaking his head. "They are an idle, shiftless race. They do but see a chance to get corn without the labor of husbandry. If it were not that they are a much bigger tribe and hope to defeat their neighbor by sheer force of numbers, they would not have dared to make open war upon the brave Popsipetels." When we reached the village, we found it in a great state of excitement. Everywhere men were seen putting their bows in order, sharpening spears, grinding battle axes, and making arrows by the hundred. Women were raising a high fence of bamboo poles all around the village. Scouts and messengers kept coming and going, bringing news of the movements of the enemy. While high up in the trees and hills about the village, we could see lookouts watching the mountains to the southward. Long Arrow brought another Indian, short but enormously broad, and introduced him to the doctor as Big Teeth, the chief warrior of the Popsipetels. The doctor volunteered to go and see the enemy and try to argue the matter out peacefully with them instead of fighting. For war, he said, was at best a stupid, wasteful business. But the two shook their heads. Such a plan was hopeless, they said. In the last war, when they had sent a messenger to do peaceful arguing, the enemy had merely hit him with an axe. While the doctor was asking Big Teeth how he meant to defend the village against attack, a cry of alarm was raised by the lookouts. "They're coming! The Jagdarags, swarming down the mountains in thousands!" "Well," said the doctor, "it's all in the day's work, I suppose. I don't believe in war, but if the village is attacked, we must help defend it." And he picked up a club from the ground and tried the heft of it against a stone. "This," he said, "seems like a pretty good tool to me." And he walked to the bamboo fence and took his place among the other waiting fighters. Then we all got hold of some kind of weapon with which to help our friends, the gallant Popsipetels. I borrowed a bow and quiver full of arrows. Jip was content to rely upon his old but still strong teeth. Chi-Chi took a bag of rocks and climbed a palm where he could throw them down upon the enemy's heads, and Bumpo marched after the doctor to the fence, armed with a young tree in one hand and a doorpost in the other. When the enemy drew near enough to be seen from where we stood, we all gasped with astonishment. The hillsides were actually covered with them, thousands upon thousands. They made our small army within the village look like a mere handful. "Saints alive!" muttered Polynesia. "Our little lot will stand no chance against that swarm. This will never do. I'm going off to get some help." Where she was going and what kind of help she meant to get, I had no idea. She just disappeared from my side. But Jip, who had heard her, poked his nose between the bamboo bars of the fence to get a better view of the enemy, and said, Likely enough, she's gone after the black parrots. Let's hope she finds them in time. Just look at those ugly ruffians climbing down the rocks. Millions of them. This fight's going to keep us all hopping.
And Jip was right. Before a quarter of an hour had gone by, our village was completely surrounded by one huge mob of yelling, raging Bag-Jagderags. I now come again to a part in the story of our voyages where things happened so quickly, one upon the other, that looking backwards, I see the picture only in a confused kind of way. I know that if it had not been for the terrible three, as they came afterwards to be fondly called in Popsipetel history, Long Arrow, Bumpo, and the doctor, the war would have been soon over, and the whole island would have belonged to the worthless Bag-Jagderags. But the Englishman, the African, and the Indian were a regiment in themselves, and between them they made that village a dangerous place for any man to try to enter. The bamboo fencing which had been hastily set up around the town was not a very strong affair, and right from the start it gave way in one place after another as the enemy thronged and crowded against it. Then the doctor, Long Arrow, and Bumpo would hurry to the weak spot. A terrific hand-to-hand fight would take place, and the enemy be thrown out. But almost instantly a cry of alarm would come from some other part of the village wall, and the three would have to rush off and do the same thing all over again. The Popsipetels were themselves no mean fighters, but the strength and weight of those three men of different lands and colors, standing close together, swinging their enormous war clubs, was really a sight for the wonder and admiration of anyone. Many weeks later, when I was passing an Indian campfire at night, I heard this song being sung. It has since become one of the traditional folk songs of the Popsipetels, the song of the Terrible Three. Oh, hear ye the song of the terrible three, and the fight that they fought by the edge of the sea. Down from the mountains, the rocks, and the crags, swarming like wasps came the Bag-Jagderags. Surrounding our village, our walls they broke down. Oh, sad was the plight of our men and our town. But heaven determined our land to set free, and sent us the help of the terrible three. One was a black, and he was dark as the night. One was a redskin, a mountain of height. But the chief was a white man, round like a bee, and all in a row stood the terrible three. Shoulder to shoulder they hammered and hit, like demons of fury they kicked and they bit. Like a wall of destruction they stood in a row, flattening enemies six at a blow. Oh, oh, strong was the redskin, fierce was the black. Bag-Jagderags trembled and tried to turn back. But 'twas of the white man they shouted, beware! He throws men's in handfuls straight up in the air. Long shall they frighten bad children at night with tales of the red and the black and the white. And long shall we sing of the terrible three and the fight that they fought by the edge of the sea. The sixth chapter, General Polynesia. But alas, even the three, mighty though they were, could not last forever against an army which seemed to have no end. In one of the hottest scrimmages, when the enemy had actually broken a particularly wide hole through the fence, I saw Long Arrow's great figure topple and come down with a spear sticking in his broad chest. For another half hour, Bumpo and the doctor fought on side by side. How their strength held out so long I cannot tell, for never a second were they given to get their breath or rest their arms. The doctor, The quiet, kindly, peaceable little doctor. Well, you wouldn't have known him if you had seen him that day, dealing out whacks you could hear a mile off, walloping and swatting in all directions. As for Bumpo, with staring eyeballs and grim-set teeth, he was a veritable demon. None dared come within yards of that wicked, wide-circling doorpost. But a stone, skillfully thrown, struck him at last in the center of the forehead, and down went the second of the three. John Dolittle, the last of the terribles, was left fighting alone. Jip and I rushed to his side and tried to take the places of the fallen ones, but far too light and too small, we made but a poor exchange. Another length of the fence crashed down, and through the widened gap, the Bag-Jagderags poured in on us like a flood.
To the canoes! To the sea!
Shouted the Popsipetels.
Fly for your lives! All is over! The war is lost!
But the doctor and I never got a chance to fly for our lives. We were swept off our feet and knocked down flat by the sheer weight of the mob. And once down, we were unable to get up again. I thought we would surely be trampled to death. But at that moment, above the din and racket of the battle, we heard the most terrifying noise that ever assaulted human ears. The sound of millions and millions of parrots, all screeching with fury together. The army, which in the nick of time Polynesia had brought to our rescue, darkened the whole sky to the westward. I asked her afterwards how many birds there were, and she said she didn't know exactly, but that they certainly numbered somewhere between 60 and 70 millions. In that extraordinarily short space of time, she had brought them from the mainland of South America. If you have ever heard a parrot screech with anger, you will know that it makes a truly frightful sound. And if you have ever been bitten by one, you will know that its bite can be a nasty and painful thing. The black parrots, coal black all over they were, except for a scarlet beak and a streak of red in wing and tail, on the word of command from Polynesia, set to work upon the Bag-Jagderags, who were now pouring through the village looking for plunder. And the black parrots' method of fighting was peculiar. This is what they did. On the head of each Bag-Jagderag, 3 or 4 parrots settled and took a good foothold in his hair with their claws. Then they leant down over the sides of his head and began clipping snips out of his ears, for all the world as though they were punching tickets. That is all they did. They never bit them anywhere else except the ears, but it won the war for us. With howls pitiful to hear, the Bag-Jagderags fell over one another in their haste to get out of that accursed village. It was no use their trying to pull the parrots off their heads, because for each head there were always 4 more parrots waiting impatiently to get on. Some of the enemy were lucky, and with only a snip or two managed to get outside the fence, where the parrots immediately left them alone. But with most, before the blackbirds had done with them, the ears presented a very singular appearance, like the edge of a postage stamp. This treatment, very painful at the time, did not, however, do them any permanent harm beyond the change in looks, and it later got to be the tribal mark of the Bag-Jagderags. No really smart young lady of this tribe would be seen walking with a man who did not have scalloped ears, for such was a proof that he had been in the Great War. And that, though it is not generally known to scientists, is how this people came to be called by the other Indian nations the ragged-eared Bag-Jagderags. As soon as the village was cleared of the enemy, the doctor turned his attention to the wounded. In spite of the length and fierceness of the struggle, there were surprisingly few serious injuries. Poor Long Arrow was the worst off. However, after the doctor had washed his wound and got him to bed, he opened his eyes and said he already felt better. Bumpo was only badly stunned. With this part of the business over, the doctor called to Polynesia to have the black parrots drive the enemy right back into their own country and to wait there, guarding them all night. Polynesia gave the short word of command, and like one bird, those millions of parrots opened their red beaks and let out once more their terrifying battle scream. The Bag-Jagderags didn't wait to be bitten a second time, but fled helter-skelter over the mountains from which they had come, whilst Polynesia and her victorious army followed watchfully behind like a great threatening black cloud. The doctor picked up his high hat, which had been knocked off in the fight, dusted it carefully, and put it on. "Tomorrow," he said, shaking his fist towards the hills, "we will arrange the terms of peace, and we will arrange them in the city of Bag-Jagderag." His words were greeted with cheers of triumph from the admiring Popsipetels. The war was over. The 7th chapter, The Peace of the Parrots. The next day we set out for the far end of the island, and reaching it in canoes, for we went by sea, after a journey of 25 hours, we remained no longer than was necessary in the city of Bag-Jagderag. When he threw himself into the fight at Popsipetel, I saw the doctor really angry for the first time in my life. But his anger, once aroused, was slow to die. All the way down the coast of the island, he never ceased to rail against this cowardly people who had attacked his friends, the Popsipetels, for no other reason but to rob them of their corn, because they were too idle to till the land themselves. And he was still angry when he reached the city of Bag-Jagderag. Long Arrow had not come with us, for he was as yet too weak from his wound. But the doctor, always clever at languages, was already getting familiar with the Indian tongue. Besides, among the half-dozen Popsipetels who accompanied us to paddle the canoes was one boy to whom we had taught a little English. He and the doctor, between them, managed to make themselves understood to the Bag-Jagderags. This people, with the terrible parrots still blackening the hills about their stone town, waiting for the word to descend and attack, were, we found, in a very humble mood. Leaving our canoes, we passed up the main street to the palace of the chief. Bumpo and I couldn't help smiling with satisfaction as we saw how the waiting crowds which lined the roadway bowed their heads to the ground as the little round angry figure of the doctor strutted ahead of us with his chin in the air. At the foot of the palace steps, the chief and all the more important personages of the tribe were waiting to meet him, smiling humbly and holding out their hands in friendliness. The doctor took not the slightest notice. He marched right by them, up the steps to the door of the palace. There he turned around and at once began to address the people in a firm voice. I never heard such a speech in my life, and I am quite sure that they never did either. First he called them a long string of names: cowards, loafers, thieves, vagabonds, good-for-nothings, bullies, and what not. Then he said he was still seriously thinking of allowing the parrots to drive them on into the sea, in order that this pleasant land might be rid once for all of their worthless carcasses. At this, a great cry for mercy went up, and the chief and all of them fell on their knees, calling out that they would submit to any conditions of peace he wished. Then the doctor called for one of their scribes, that is, a man who did picture writing, and on the stone walls of the palace of Bag-Jagderag, he bade him write down the terms of the peace as he dictated it. This peace is known as the Peace of the Parrots, and unlike most peaces, was and is strictly kept, even to this day. It was quite long in words. The half of the palace front was covered with picture writing, and 50 pots of paint were used before the weary scribe had done. But the main part of it all was that there should be no more fighting, and that the two tribes should give solemn promise to help one another whenever there was corn famine or other distresses in the lands belonging to either. This greatly surprised the Bag-Jagderags. They had expected from the doctor's angry face that he would at least chop a couple of hundred heads off, and probably make the rest of them slaves for life. But when they saw that he only meant kindly by them, their great fear of him changed to a tremendous admiration. And as he ended his long speech and walked briskly down the steps again on his way back to the canoes, the group of chieftains threw themselves at his feet and cried,
"Do but stay with us, great lord, and all the riches of Bag-Jagderag shall be poured into your lap. Gold mines we know of in the mountains, and pearl beds beneath the sea. Only stay with us, that your all-powerful wisdom may lead our council and our people in prosperity and peace."
The doctor held up his hand for silence. "No man," said he, "would wish to be the guest of the Bag-Jagderags till they had proved by their deeds that they are an honest race. Be true to the terms of the peace, and from yourselves shall come good government and prosperity. Farewell." Then he turned and, followed by Bumpo, the Popsipetels, and myself, walked rapidly down to the canoes. The 8th chapter, The Hanging Stone. But the change of heart in the Bag-Jagderags was really sincere. The doctor had made a great impression on them, a deeper one than even he himself realized at the time. In fact, I sometimes think that that speech of his from the palace steps had more effect upon the Indians of Spider Monkey Island than had any of his great deeds which, great though they were always magnified and exaggerated when the news of them was passed from mouth to mouth. A sick girl was brought to him as he reached the place where the boats lay. She turned out to have some quite simple ailment, which he quickly gave the remedy for. But this increased his popularity still more. And when he stepped into his canoe, the people all around us actually burst into tears. It seems, I learned this afterwards, that they thought he was going away across the sea for good to the mysterious foreign lands from which he had come. Some of the chieftains spoke to the Popsipetels as we pushed off. What they said I did not understand, but we noticed that several canoes filled with Bag-Jagderags followed us at a respectful distance all the way back to Popsipetel. The doctor had determined to return by the other shore so that we should be thus able to make a complete trip round the island's shores. Shortly after we started, while still off the lower end of the island, we sighted a steep point on the coast where the sea was in a great state of turmoil, white with soapy froth. On going nearer, we found that this was caused by our friendly whales, who were still faithfully working away with their noses against the end of the island, driving us northward. We had been kept so busy with the war that we had forgotten all about them. But as we paused and watched their mighty tails lashing and churning the sea, we suddenly realized that we had not felt cold in quite a long while. Speeding up our boat, lest the island be carried away from us altogether, we passed on up the coast, and here and there we noticed that the trees on the shore already looked greener and more healthy. Spider Monkey Island was getting back into her home climates. About halfway to Popsipetel, we went ashore and spent 2 or 3 days exploring the central part of the island. Our Indian paddlers took us up into the mountains, very steep and high in this region, overhanging the sea, and they showed us what they called the Whispering Rocks. This was a very peculiar and striking piece of scenery. It was like a great vast basin or circus in the mountains, and out of the center of it there rose a table of rock with an ivory chair upon it. All around this, the mountains went up like stairs or theater seats to a great height, except at one narrow end, which was open to a view of the sea. You could imagine it a council place or concert hall for giants, and the rock table in the center the stage for performers, or the stand for the speaker. We asked our guides why it was called the Whispering Rocks, and they said,
"Go down into it, and we will show you."
the great bowl was miles deep and miles wide. We scrambled down the rocks, and they showed us how, even when you stood far, far apart from one another, you merely had to whisper in that great place, and everyone in the theater could hear you. This was, the doctor said, on account of the echoes which played backwards and forwards between the high walls of rock. Our guides told us that it was here, in days long gone, by when the Popsipetels owned the whole of Spider-Monkey Island, that the kings were crowned. The ivory chair upon the table was the throne in which they sat. And so great was the big theater that all the Indians on the island were able to get seats in it to see the ceremony. They showed us also an enormous hanging stone perched on the edge of a volcano's crater, the highest summit in the whole island. Although it was very far below us, we could see it quite plainly, and it looked wobbly enough to be pushed off its perch with the hand. There was a legend among the people, they said, that when the greatest of all Popsipetel's kings should be crowned in the ivory chair, this hanging stone would tumble into the volcano's mouth and go straight down to the center of the earth. The doctor said he would like to go and examine it closer. And when we were come to the lip of the volcano, it took us half a day to get up to it, we found the stone was unbelievably large, big as a cathedral. Underneath it, we could look right down into a black hole which seemed to have no bottom. The doctor explained to us that volcanoes sometimes spurted up fire from these holes in their tops, but that those on floating islands were always cold and dead. "Stubbins," he said, looking up at the great stone towering above us, "do you know what would most likely happen if that boulder should fall in?" "No," said I. "What?" "You remember the air chamber, which the porpoises told us lies under the center of this island?" "Yes." "Well, this stone is heavy enough, if it fell into the volcano, to break through into that air chamber from above. And once it did, the air would escape, and the floating island would float no more. It would sink." "But then everybody on it would be drowned, wouldn't they?" said Bumpo. "Oh, no, not necessarily. That would depend on the depth of the sea where the sinking took place. The island might touch bottom when it had only gone down, say, 100 feet. And there would be lots of it still sticking up above the water then, wouldn't there?"
"Yes," said Bumpo, "I suppose there would. Well, let us hope that the ponderous fragment does not lose its equilibriosity, for I don't believe it would stop at the center of the earth. More likely it would fall right through the world and come out the other side."
Many other wonders there were which these men showed us in the central regions of their island, but I have not time or space to tell you of them now. Descending towards the shore again, we noticed that we were still being watched, even here among the highlands, by the Bag-Jagderags who had followed us. And when we put to sea once more, a boatload of them proceeded to go ahead of us in the direction of Popsipetel. Having lighter canoes, they traveled faster than our party, and we judged that they should reach the village, if that was where they were going, many hours before we could. The doctor was now becoming anxious to see how Long Arrow was getting on, so we all took turns at the paddles and went on traveling by moonlight through the whole night. We reached Popsipetel just as the dawn was breaking. To our great surprise, we found that not only we, but the whole village also, had been up all night. A great crowd was gathered about the dead chief's house, and as we landed our canoes upon the beach, we saw a large number of old men, the seniors of the tribe, coming out at the main door. We inquired what was the meaning of all this, and were told that the election of a new chief had been going on all through the whole night. Bumpo asked the name of the new chief, but this, it seemed, had not yet been given out. It would be announced at midday. As soon as the doctor had paid a visit to Long Arrow and seen that he was doing nicely, we proceeded to our own house at the far end of the village. Here we ate some breakfast and then lay down to take a good rest. Rest, indeed, we needed, for life had been strenuous and busy for us ever since we had landed on the island, and it wasn't many minutes after our weary heads struck the pillows that the whole crew of us were sound asleep.